Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana if you are new here. And if you have been coming back every day, you might notice I'm in a different location today. We had some technical difficulties, so we're going to hope that our Wi-Fi is better down here. So just going to go ahead and tell you, if we blip out, stay with us. It is the working from home life that unfortunately we're all getting used to at this point. Today, though, we have a really interesting conversation, and that is one about this large indictment that hit yesterday from federal court involving 6 Alabama educators and over 100 federal charges of fraud and wire fraud, conspiracy, things like that, falsifying records. So a lot of stuff to unpack here. We have our own AL.com's Trish Crane. She is here to explain all of this and really tell us how this happened, how these 6 lifelong educators are now charged with all of these counts of fraud and what exactly this scheme was about. So, Trish, I appreciate you coming, using your expertise to kind of explain this to us. And I have to go ahead and say, I covered courts for several years and I loved it, but this is a very hard to unpack case. If you just look at this indictment, it is very difficult to go through and figure out exactly what happened.
Agreed. Hours of reviewing it yesterday. We've been hearing that the FBI was investigating. We knew that the FBI had visited Dr. Holliday, Athens City's former superintendent now, his office, and he was placed on paid leave. We knew something was going on, but really it was very difficult to get information about this because I was asking questions along the way, but no one would talk. So, and I guess that's how FBI cases go. But so what it boils down to is that Dr. Holliday, Trey Holliday, former Athens City School superintendent, and Dr. Tom Sisk of Limestone County Schools, former superintendent, they have both been charged along with others, 4 others, in a scheme that really was designed to defraud the public school education trust fund and pump up enrollment in those schools, in the public schools in those 2 districts, with private school students, and just say that they were doing virtual school. Virtual school became a thing about 5 years ago. I mean, virtual school got a lot of attention this year because of the pandemic, but we've been doing virtual school in Alabama for about 5 years. And Athens City and Limestone, along with a couple of others, had these statewide virtual schools where you could enroll kids that were not in your district. Most of them, like I know a large district down south has a virtual school, and they confine it just to the kids that actually live in their county. Well, these 2 school districts were picking up kids all over the state. And, it turns out that these children, these students that they were counting as virtual school students, were really fully enrolled in a private school, which is just, like fraudulent on its face, right?
These kids that Athens City Schools and Limestone County Schools were using in their enrollment numbers for their virtual schools didn't even know that they were being used in enrollment numbers for those schools.
That's exactly what the indictment says. It says that the students didn't know and their parents didn't know, which, as a parent who had children in public schools, the idea, and private schools, but the idea that your child's information could be taken and just from a private school and given to the public schools without your knowledge, it's got a lot of privacy problems, things that people in Alabama really worry about privacy-wise. So, but they were using that information. They not only said they were enrolled, they gave, according to the indictment, they created fake report cards. Some of those kids took standardized tests, and they, were fully, John Doe, a child who maybe was attending one of these private schools. John Doe had a fully fleshed out student record within the public school, which is just kind of stunning.
It is. It is stunning. Now, I've got some notes in front of me to make sure that we keep this right and go along with what is in the indictment and not stray from that. But here are these 6 educators who are charged. We have William Trey Holiday III, also known as Trey Holiday. He's the former superintendent of Athens City Schools. He's charged with over 100 counts of fraud, wire fraud, falsifying student info, and other things. We have Deborah Irby Holiday. She is formerly an employee of Athens City Schools as well. We have William Richard Carter Jr. He is the executive director of planning for Athens City Schools. We have David Webb Tutt, Gregory Earl Corcoran, and Thomas Michael Sisk. And Dr. Sisk is formerly the superintendent of Limestone County School District. So something I think that is really interesting, I wanted to give those names. We have those names and what they were charged with in the story that we have linked in these comments here, so I don't have to read all these charges off. But something that Trish, you mentioned earlier, and I think this is really important because virtual schools this year is just so common. We all know what virtual schools are, but virtual schools have been around for a little while here in Alabama. And this investigation is a years-long investigation, and it really centers on the school years of 2016 to 2017 and 2017 to 2018. Those are the school years that this investigation focuses on. Now, the indictment says that those 2 districts, Athens City and Limestone County, were improperly paid about $7 million in state education funding for those 2 school years for the private school kids that were unknowingly enrolled in these locations. So, Trish, I think the first question is, how do these educators, how do these schools, I understand that their virtual school is a statewide option. It's not limited to Athens City and Limestone County, but how do these private school kids' names and informations get released to those 2 districts in the first place? How did they get that information?
According to the indictment, it was Dr. Holliday and Dr. Carter, Rick Carter, who recruited a lot of these private schools. They first approached Marengo Academy, I think is the first one listed in the indictment, but other schools, private schools, were approached, and they said, "Hey, look, we will give you laptop computers for your students," which, private schools in rural areas generally don't have a ton of money. I don't know the financial status of the ones that are listed here in the indictment, but I know a number of them have closed in recent years. The population in the rural areas is just not, it's not going up. So these were, I think 6 different schools are named in the indictment, but these are schools that according to the indictment, Dr. Holliday and Dr. Carter said, "Hey, give us the student names. We'll give you laptop computers, and we'll let you use our online learning software called Odysseyware." And they had, we've heard of things like Edgenuity, and, there are a lot of different online learning platforms out there. Odysseyware is the one that is named in the indictment. And it's, from what I understand, it's like online school, right? You don't really work with teachers. It's just a curriculum that you can access. And one of the points, so this was an enticement, right? Because maybe we didn't have laptop computers. The indictment mentions that it also, they offered increased internet capabilities. They didn't really go into detail with that. A lot of our rural areas don't have great broadband access. I mean, that's like really been brought out during the pandemic. But so there were some benefits. In a couple of cases, they mentioned like a donation to the school. Something I think is important to say that the investigator mentioned yesterday during the press conference is there are no private school officials that are accused of wrongdoing, right? They're I want to say at this point, but they said, the private school officials did not individually profit from the ill-gotten gains, but that the schools themselves may have. So I think this is an ongoing investigation.
Right. And so we look at these things that these Athens City Schools, Limestone County Schools were offering to these much smaller, oftentimes much more rural schools, laptops, increased internet access, or some form of internet capability. We don't know exactly what that could be, but an internet boost, we'll say, computers and things like that. Is that wrong of the private schools to say, sure, we would love to participate in that program? Or is that common in the education world?
Yikes. I don't think I can really answer that, whether it's right or wrong. I mean, I think it's all depends on what benefits are attached to it. And if you're, I mean, in this case, obviously the public school officials were defrauding the public school taxpayers by saying that these kids were actually fully enrolled because, again, we saw a lot of kids shift to virtual school this year. And those same schools that are named in the indictment, they saw a big increase in virtual schooling this year. They got, the Limestone County schools, thousands more kids. The virtual school there got more, but supposedly these are public school kids. One of the questions that I have is, well, like, how do we know? Because it does appear from the indictment that it was the State Department of Education that started asking questions. Who are these kids and where are they at? And, can we talk to their parents and, those kinds of things. So
I'm going to stop you real quick, Trish, and answer a few questions I'm seeing that we're getting at. So I've got Diane. When did the investigation begin? So this is a federal investigation. It began 2 years ago, and it involved more than, it involved years and hundreds of documents and about 200 investigators, I believe, that we had in that report that Trish wrote yesterday. So very long, very detailed investigation. And a question from Terry.
200 interviews.
200 interviews, excuse me. I can't read my own.
Is what they said, yeah.
Can't read my own handwriting. About 2 years and 200 interviews. Right. Now, question from Terry. It said, I don't think I really understand the crime. So Terry, let's break this down, because I'm with you. And again, I covered courts for years, and I was looking at this story, looking at this indictment, and I was like, what is happening? So Athens City Schools, Limestone County Schools have a big virtual schooling program that is not limited to their neighborhood, to their location. It's statewide. So the indictment alleges, and Trish, correct me if I'm wrong, the indictment alleges that administrators from these two schools, the 6 that are named, they went out and got kids their information from smaller, more rural private schools and used that information to bump up their rates in online schooling. Instead of saying we have 100 kids or however many, they're saying, well, we have 200. And about that percentage of the kids from those private schools, they weren't actually enrolled. They took that information, took those names, and boosted their numbers. That meant that their schools got more than $7 million in state education funding during those years. And there is also allegations in that indictment, I'm looking at this now, that Trey Holiday had gotten cash payments out of that as well. This indictment does not specify the amount of cash payments that Mr. Holiday received, but it does allege there were cash payments. Trish?
Yeah, and I think what's important there, so one thing we haven't really broken down is there is an Alabama law about virtual schooling, right? And it says that you can virtually school a child, public school, and you can get money, you can get paid for them, but they cannot also be enrolled in a private school. Like, that's spelled out in law. Like, you can't be fully enrolled in a private school and fully enrolled in a public school. Okay. So,
and especially if you don't know about one of them.
Yeah. And the investigator made it a point, and it's clear in the indictment, that the children that were enrolled in the public virtual school really were not accessing that education. They were not, like, there is the law connected to virtual school said you can count a student as an enrollee of your virtual school if they take 6 credits, right? And I think I want to say per semester, maybe per year. I think it's per year. But these children didn't approach anywhere near that, according to the investigators. Like, instead, they used the online curriculum as enrichment or maybe homework assignments, but they did not meaningfully learn the material. Like, if like college class, online class, like, it's like you've got to cover all of this material in order for you to say that you've taken the class. Mm-hmm. Well, the same is true with Alabama's virtual school law. And these children were not actually accessing the course materials. Does that make
Something
sense?
too that we need to notice, some, but not all, of these parents of these students have been notified of the alleged student information theft. So that means, again, these kids didn't know their information was being used to say that they were enrolled in this virtual school. And there's a lot of these kids and students and their parents who have not even been notified yet because they are still going through that investigation. So question from Jason, is it true that the fact the students were enrolled in the private school and not enrolled in the virtual school. That is true. Jason, they were enrolled in their separate private schools, and they were not they didn't know they were enrolled in the virtual school. The crime here allegedly is that the people at these Athens City schools and Limestone County schools said they were enrolled in virtual. That's the alleged crime.
Correct.
Now, I've got a question for you, Trish, that I think is very interesting. And with your background of covering education, I'm thinking you would have more insight. This is from David. David says, are the board members, presumably of Athens and Limestone schools, are they accountable for these actions?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it's an ongoing investigation. I know, like the details that were included in the indictment were down to text messages that Dr. Holliday had sent, or emails. They reference emails, and I don't know. I don't know how far it goes. I mean, when I think about that, there were more than 200 interviews. I know some people had to be working with the FBI, is my guess, right? So I think we'll find out more about who knew what when. I don't know what the board members knew. I don't know if they knew that these students were not actually, that they were still enrolled in their private school. If the children had unenrolled from their private school, we would not be having this discussion. Right. And there are plenty of kids who leave their private school, and enroll in public school every day. And whether that's virtual or in person. So that's not an uncommon occurrence. The uncommon part, the crime here again, is that they were enrolled in both. And state law specifically prohibits that.
Diane, who stumbled upon this? This was an FBI investigation, Trish, but didn't you say that initially it seems that it might have been the Alabama State Department of Education that was initially asking some questions?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. Somebody asked that at the press conference yesterday, but of course they're not going to tell us. But I know that as early as my first article about virtual schools was back in May of 2017. And that was really at the end of the first full school year that these statewide virtual schools were up and running. And, we knew that there's money attached. I mean, basically for each child that you enroll, the school system got, $5,500 or $6,000 from the state. Now, that's a lot of money. And especially, I had questions. Well, if they're virtual, how much effort are you putting into the child? We know that an in-person student, that they have teachers and they have materials, and, there are all of these sort of costs associated with them. But I know that the then superintendent, the reason that I wrote the story back in May of 2017 was because he was asking questions. And in the indictment, it does mention that the State Department started asking questions in as early 2017.
So when you talk about that money, let's note those two districts were improperly paid, according to the indictment, about $7 million in state education funding for those 2 school years. And then there is also the allegation in that indictment that Trey Holiday got cash payments as well. There is no word on how much those cash payments were, but it is we can assume that it is not part of that $7 million in state education funding. But again, it was not noted specifically in that indictment. Question here from Misty. She says, is providing the students information to Athens and Limestone, is that not a crime? And I think she's alluding to what we talked about a minute ago, where these 2 school districts went into these private, smaller rural schools and said, hey, we can give you computers. We can help you with your internet problems. We can do this and that and the other if you give us this information. Trish, what do you think?
Yeah, well, but some of the charges are aggravated identity theft. Right. So, and in the indictment towards the end, they list all of these students' initials that are, presumably the students' identities that were stolen. So I think they are addressing that as identity theft. And I don't know, I mean, I have so many questions, but is the provision, somebody gave them those names, right? And so, But as far as we know, these are the only people that are going to be indicted on these identity theft charges. Again, it's an ongoing investigation. It's not an ongoing operation. I think it is over. I don't think any of these kids are enrolled in the virtual school anymore. I've been unable to get a response to the question from the State Department as to how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again. So hopefully that response will be forthcoming.
Going through some of these questions, and These are some really great questions that are coming from this thread here, Trish. We're going to have to write them down and go get answers to all of them. But something that I think is interesting is there is a question here that is, what about the teachers? How would the teachers know about the enrollment of these schools? What about the missing kids that are neither in school or in virtual? I think the best answer to this one might be Chris. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. That the teachers, presumably, of these private school students didn't know that the Athens and Limestone school systems were using that information. I think that is essentially what the indictment is saying. Trish?
Well, that's kind of unclear. They don't really go into a lot of detail. One of the things that they do mention in the indictment is that Deborah Holliday did teacher training on how to use the online portal, the Odysseyware. So she did hold meetings. She did go into these private schools and train the teachers on how to use Odysseyware. What I know about teachers, they don't really follow all. I mean, they're interested in what's happening in front of them in the classroom. They're not really looking to make sure that, nobody's double counting students, which was in fact happening. So I don't know about any culpability among the teachers. I think the teachers were just using the tool Odysseyware where they needed to help their children learn.
A question here that is interesting from Jason. He says, the private school officials, were they not aware that monies would be going to the inappropriate places? That's number one. Who paid for the laptops they got? And was student information sent to a destination unbeknownst to their parents? So Jason, I'm going to start with your last question. Was student information sent to the destination unbeknownst to their parents? Correct. The indictment is alleging that the student information went to these virtual schools without their knowledge. There is a line even in the indictment that says some, but not all of these students' parents have even been notified at this point that their students' information has been used. Trish, what about those other questions? The private school officials, did they not realize that money was going to be going to these virtual schools, and who was paying for this?
So number one, I don't know the answer to that question. That is not clearly spelled out in the indictment. 6 schools are named. None of the people that are affiliated with those schools are named. So they use words like the headmaster agreed to do this. And one of the academies was approached, and Dr. Holliday, according to the indictment, said, hey, if you recreate yourself as a homeschool association, then this is all cool. Like, this is all above, like, we have no problems. And they did go so far as to reconstitute themselves as a homeschool association. I do not know if they still are, but they dropped the academy name and they went to say that they were a homeschool association. So that supposedly was going to give them cover. What's striking about this indictment is how, if you were going, based on the information in the indictment, every which way to defraud the public schools was there. Like, everything, down to, at some point, like I think I said, they created fake report cards for these kids. They created, I don't know about the standardized test. One of the questions I asked yesterday was, because the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Inspector General is involved. And I asked about, what about federal accountability? I mean, we're kind of sticklers on that. We got in trouble a few years ago for inflating our high school graduation rates. So were these, private school students? What is all that? And of course, we don't have a response to that. This is an ongoing investigation. There are a lot of unanswered questions here. What was that about who got paid?
So I was just going to quickly answer that. The money here is that those 2 districts, it was federal money. You're correct there. That was $7 million in state education funding for those 2 years. But then the next, let me ask you about that money in a minute, Trish. But those cash payments to Trey Holiday that are alleged cash payments, we don't know where those came from or how much those were. Trish, is that money, that $7 million in the state education funding, does that come from the feds or is that state money?
The way it was described in the indictment is it was state educational funding. So state money comes on a per child basis, right? $5,500, $6,000. I think it might be up to about $6,500 a child now, a student now. Federal money is typically attached to students based on their poverty status or their disability status. So I don't know about federal funding. They actually don't mention federal funding in here. However, having the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General, which is sort of the law enforcement arm of the U.S. Department of Education, they're involved in this. So they just did not mention federal funding in the indictment.
I'm going to ask you one more question. That's about the money. Everybody wants to know, well, what happens with all that money? Now, this is, again, we're going to talk about that money that came from that state education funding, not those alleged cash payments. We don't know enough about that to talk about those yet. But Trish, what's going to happen to those millions of dollars that the school districts received?
Yesterday during the press conference, that was asked, and the response was by I think it was the investigator who responded, said, the question was, are the taxpayers in Athens or Limestone on the hook for this money? And the answer was, the only people who are on the hook for this money are the people named in the indictment. So I don't think that this is going to impact, because another thing we need to say about the $7 million, it's unclear whether all of that money was actually paid or to the school system, or if that is what they would have earned if the state had paid them for those students. Because at one point in the indictment, they mentioned that the State Department withheld a portion of that growth funding. I'm not going to go into it, but there is a way that school districts who grow quickly can get additional funding throughout the year, because like they didn't know that they were going to grow quickly. And of course, that was the case with these virtual schools. So some of this money was held back. So it didn't all go. My understanding is not all $7 million was actually paid. I just don't know the details.
This is a very interesting, very deep case here, Trish. We appreciate you coming, breaking down what you know. We're really hoping that as you learn more, you'll come back and give us an update, because I know so many people have questions. We're going to jump in, try to answer anything we didn't in the comments. I'll get Trish in there and get her to answer what she can. But otherwise, Trish, just keep us updated on what you know. We'll link all of the coverage we have on this case here in the comment thread. And otherwise, Trish, thanks again.
Thanks.
Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Have a great Wednesday. We'll see you tomorrow.